Today we will be discussing the life of Joseph Stalin, leader of the Soviet Union and one of the deadliest dictators in human history. Stalin rose from humble origins through the ranks of the newly formed Soviet Union to become the leader of one of the most powerful countries in human history, all the while leaving behind a body count in the tens of millions. So, how did we get here? Stalin was born in 1878 in Georgia, in what was then the Russian Empire, as the son of a shoemaker. He was initially sent off by his parents to be trained as a priest, during which time he was a rather rebellious student and also an avid reader. And it was during this time that he came across the works of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. And from that, Stalin developed communist beliefs. And after getting involved with some local communist groups and getting up to some mischief, he was eventually exiled to Siberia. But it was also around this time that he joined the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party. Or more specifically, he joined a faction of it which had become known as the Bolsheviks, led by one Vladimir Lenin. And Stalin, he had a bit of a talent for raising money for the party through theft. And so he'd go around raising money for the party through crime, and that's basically how he spent much of his early years as a member of the Bolshevik Party. However, it wouldn't be until 1917 that he really began to move up in the world. So, February 1917, and the Tsar, last Tsar of Russia, Nicholas II, has just been overthrown by his government, which has then declared itself to be the new provisional government of the brand new Russian Republic. And at the same time, the communists, which were now coming more and more under the total control of Vladimir Lenin, set up sort of their own government at the same time. The Soviets, basically workers' councils, it was sort of a power struggle between them and the provisional government. And it was a bit messy during this time, but in any case, Stalin took the opportunity to move to St. Petersburg, which was then at that time called Petrograd, and he joined Lenin's government. And once the Bolsheviks under Lenin finally overthrew the provisional government in October of 1917 and the October Revolution, and Stalin would therefore gain some various postings within Lenin's new government and do a number of things. He supported the Red Terror, which is basically the Bolsheviks going around killing anyone that they believed to be anti-revolutionary. Stalin would also find himself gaining positions within the military high command, and eventually becoming a general during the Russian Civil War, and, more importantly, the Polish-Soviet War. The Polish-Soviet War of 1919 to 1921 saw the brand new Second Polish Republic go to war with the Soviet Union. The Soviets actually pushed the Polish forces all the way back to the Polish capital of Warsaw, and they could have taken it too. However, the Polish lines held firm against the relentless Soviet attacks by Mikhail Tukhachevsky. And Tukhachevsky, he desperately needed more reinforcements if he was actually going to take the city of Warsaw. As if he took Warsaw, then that would basically be the end of the war and the end of the new Polish Republic. So he desperately needed reinforcements, and that was going to come in the form of Stalin's reinforcements. But Stalin decided to go off and get some personal glory for himself, so he attacked the Polish city of Lvov, these days a part of Ukraine and known as Lviv. And so Stalin's refusal to support Tukhachevsky's assault on Warsaw would end up backfiring, as Tukhachevsky would get defeated, and Poland would actually have the Soviets on the run right up until they signed the peace treaty, which would push the border all the way into Belarus. The Polish-Soviet War was also a major embarrassment for one Lev Trotsky. who was the chief of the Red Army, the Soviet Union's army at this time, and he wasn't particularly fond of Stalin, and for that matter, Stalin wasn't particularly fond of Trotsky either. Now, with the war largely settled, the time came to organise this new state, and Stalin was given the role of General Secretary of the Communist Party. Now, what did this role entail? Well, he was actually given it as a bit of a joke. As one of those kinds of roles that was supposed to just keep him occupied, not give him much actual power, but keep him occupied so he'd just be pretty much just off in a corner somewhere where he wouldn't really be able to do much. But what the position of General Secretary actually was, it meant that Stalin was effectively in charge of organising the party, and also handing out all the sort of low-level rank-and-file jobs, which meant that he gave all of those low-level jobs and low to somewhat high-level jobs throughout the Soviet bureaucracy to all of his loyalists and allies, which meant that he was allowed to effectively just spread his influence gradually throughout the entire sort of state apparatus of the Soviet Union. Now, Stalin during this time also had some disagreements with Lenin over a number of things. For example, Lenin wanted to reorganize the Caucasus into a Georgian, Armenian, and Azerbaijani Soviet Socialist republics. Stalin wanted a united Transcaucasian one, which he got and then ended up getting dissolved in the 30s. But the main disagreement was over the new economic policy. The new economic policy was Lenin's original plan for, trying to modernize Russia. As basically what it sought to do was redistribute all the land to a whole bunch of peasants and introduce some forms of what could probably be called state capitalism. And Stalin was vehemently opposed to this, but it wouldn't matter for long, as Lenin would go on to die in 1924, and Stalin, being the general secretary and the one in charge of organising everything, was able to lead the funeral procession, while at the same time he also gave his old rival Trotsky the wrong date for the funeral, so it made it look like Trotsky had upstaged Lenin's funeral, which wasn't a particularly good look. But in any case, with the death of Lenin, who had been the sole centralised leader of the Soviet Union for its entire existence by this stage, it went into a period of collective leadership. As we can see here, we've got Stalin alongside Alexei Rykov, Lev Kamenev, and Grigory Zinoviev. All three of these men would be dead within about a decade. So, now that collective leadership had taken over, power struggles immediately began. Now, as I've already mentioned, Trotsky had been incredibly embarrassed by the whole fiasco of the Polish-Soviet War, and also just about everyone else in the new collective leadership, or the Politburo of the Soviet Union, kind of hated him. And they saw him as arrogant and also a threat to their own power. So what Stalin did, quite cleverly, is he allied the so-called rightists within the party, so like Bukharin and Rykov. These were the ones that supported the new economic policy. And so he allied with them in order to eventually build up enough momentum to get Trotsky actually expelled from the Communist Party, and then later exiled from the Soviet Union altogether. And from there, Trotsky he'd go around the world to various places: Turkey, Norway, France. He eventually settled in Turkey, and then had a rather unfortunate run-in with an ice pick. But meanwhile, back in the Soviet Union, and Stalin, now in a much more powerful position, was able to, by the end of the decade, eventually turn on those allies within the right wing of the party by about 1929-ish. And so by the 1930s, he was in effectively full control. There were still factions within the party that somewhat opposed him, and such as the leftists, so Kamenev and Smirnov and Zinoviev and such, and the rightists, so Bukharin and Rykov and all that. But Stalin was mostly in total control of the party and began enacting some of his policies, such as collectivization, which was sort of the exact opposite to the new economic policy, where whilst the economic policy redistributed land to the peasants and tried to introduce some forms of limited state capitalism, Stalin's policy of collectivization nationalized those farms, merged them all into big super farms in order to try and be more efficient. Now, the peasants obviously weren't too happy to see their lands that they had been given by Lenin just being stripped away from them, and so in response, the Soviet Union branded these landowning peasants as kulaks and then went about killing them and forcefully stripping them of their lands. And these policies would eventually lead to the Holodomor, which was a series of famines throughout 1932, which the Soviets then used to genocide the Ukrainian people, with the death toll reaching at least a couple million, maybe more, or in one of the most brutal genocides seen in history up until that point. So, now we're properly into the 1930s, and Stalin felt that it was about time that he dealt with some of his opposition. And the opportunity arose in 1934 with the assassination of a certain Sergei Kirov. He had been a high-ranking member of the party and a close associate of Stalin. Well, in 1934 he was assassinated, and Stalin blamed his assassination on the so-called left opposition. And these had been the ones that had supported, that rather than supporting Stalin's belief and policy of socialism in one country, which called for the Soviet Union to build itself up before they could even think about exporting communism elsewhere, the leftists, they were a bit more sort of revolutionary minded and a bit more focused on spreading communism globally. Well, they were rivals of Stalin, and so Stalin blamed the assassination of Kirov on them, and so they get imprisoned, sent off to the gulags, which were also being founded about this time. And this was carried out by a Genrikh Yagoda, the director of the NKVD, which was at the time the Soviet secret police. It would eventually end up getting replaced by the KGB, but so basically you can think of it as the KGB of the 1930s. So Yagoda, Stalin got rid of him and eventually had Yagoda executed, and had him replaced by this man, Nikolai Yezhov, who's a bit more fanatical, shall we say. And then Stalin went a bit purge mad, really. He purging anyone who he deemed to be a potential threat. Famously, he purged the army, including Mikhail Tukhachevsky, the general that I mentioned earlier that had tried to take Warsaw, but of course failed. Well, Stalin had him purged from the party and executed. And sort of decapitated the leadership and high command of the Soviet army, replacing them with loyal but incompetent officers, which would really come back to bite the Soviets in the rear end later on. Meanwhile, Stalin also took the opportunity to purge the so-called rightist faction of the party, so the ones that had supported the new economic policy. Well, now they were being thrown in the gulags, and then by 1936, 37, 38, executed. The Great Purge also targeted a lot of minorities, such as Volga Germans and Crimean Tatars, so a lot of ethnic cleansing as well around this time and forced relocations. It really was a very brutal period. But in any case, no one was truly safe from the Purge. No matter who you were, whether you worked in a factory or at the very upper echelons of the party. And you may be wondering why no one really stepped in to try and stop this, to try and oust Stalin. Well, it's due to a number of reasons. First of all, the Great Purge, it wasn't conducted all at once. It was a person imprisoned here, a person arrested there, a disappearance here. And so, for the most part, people went, well, I haven't done anything wrong, so therefore I'm okay. And, of course, most of them would have believed that, well, if the party has decided to arrest these people, then clearly they're guilty, and I haven't done anything wrong, so therefore I'm safe. And also, no one really wanted to take on that sort of personal risk of actually trying to speak out, as for all they know, they were perfectly in the clear, and then speaking out would get them, and likely also their family, imprisoned or executed. So why would they speak out? Why would they take that risk? And so the Great Purge was able to be carried out relatively quickly. And it wasn't until it began to have a negative impact on factory outputs that Stalin finally declared the internal enemies to have been purged. Those internal enemies usually he referred to as Trotskyists, and yeah, well, that's just it really. Stalin used Trotsky as the big sort of scapegoat that he could attack and basically blame all the problems on, and that he'd get the people all scared of. So yeah, Trotsky became sort of the boogeyman for the Soviet Union during this time. And then once the Great Purge had sort of wrapped up a bit, Stalin got rid of Yezhov because he knew a bit too much and had sort of outlived his usefulness, and replaced him with Lavrentiy Beria, who was one of the most despicable people in all of human history. In fact, to the point where Stalin would eventually refer to him as his Himmler. And as we can see here, the purge also extended to the alteration of historical records. It's down to, as we can see here, photographs being altered to crop out people that had since been purged. So, now rolling in to the Second World War. So, right before the invasion of Poland in 1939, the Germans reached out to the Soviets and signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, named after the Soviet Foreign Minister Vyacheslav Molotov and the German Foreign Minister Joachim von Ribbentrop. And the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact, it was, on the surface, it was just a simple non-aggression pact, but what it was in reality was an agreement which would effectively split Eastern Europe between the Germans and the Soviets. So the Germans, they'd get Western Poland and Hungary and Czechoslovakia and all that, whilst the Soviets would get Eastern Poland, Bessarabia, the Baltic states, and Finland. Now, most of that they got pretty easy. Finland, the Soviets actually invaded, with the intention being to conquer the entire country. And while they suffered immense losses which they reasonably shouldn't have ever really been able to suffer, considering the sheer disparity in army size, but the Finns fought ferociously, with figures such as Simo Häyhä, or the White Death. And it eventually came to the point where, whilst the Finns had been pushed back, they inflicted so many casualties on the Soviets that the Soviets decided to come to the negotiation table, and whilst they would gain Finnish Karelia and a couple of other concessions, it was still a rather big embarrassment for the Soviets. But they would soon find themselves with bigger problems, as in 1941 along comes the Germans, breaking their Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact with Operation Barbarossa, the largest land invasion in human history. And the Soviets were caught surprisingly off guard. In fact, the Allies, as the British and the Americans, tried to warn Stalin that an attack was coming, but Stalin just sort of buried his head in the sand and ignored it, really. So the Soviets were pushed back all the way to the gates of Moscow, with German soldiers in sight of the spires and domes of Moscow's Kremlin. And so, with the situation being so dire, Stalin gave a famous order, Order number 227, not one step back. And it was carried out to a T. As after the winter of 41, which, quick side note here, the Germans didn't invade in the winter, they invaded in the summer. They invaded as early in the year as they could. It just so happens that they were still in the process of invading the Soviet Union by the time that winter finally rolled round and halted their advance. So, the more you know. But in any case, after this, the German advance stalled, and then after a series of key battles, was Perhaps most famously the Battle of Stalingrad, the single largest battle in all of human history, and other engagements such as the Battle of Kursk, the Germans were finally pushed back by the Soviets all the way to Berlin, as the Soviet Red Banner was finally able to flutter over the German capital. So, what to do at the end of the war? Well, the Soviets had spent the war cooperating to some degree with the Western Allies, as we can see here. A photo of them at the 1943 Tehran conference, as we can see Stalin sat next to US President Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Churchill. Also, they would have a series of conferences, the Tehran conference in 1943, the Yalta conference in 1945, and then the Potsdam conference, held in Potsdam, Germany, in 1945, which all sort of laid out the post-war order in Europe. So, what they basically decided on was basically splitting the European continent between the Soviets in the east and the Allies in the west. And the Soviets, under Stalin, promised to hold free and fair elections in all of the states that they were supervising. And, of course, by free and fair, they mean communist, 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 communist. And as such, communist governments were installed in Romania, Bulgaria, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Poland, and East Germany. And as Churchill so eloquently put it in a speech of his from 1950, an iron curtain has descended across the European continent. And with that iron curtain now acting as the new division between the East and the West. So now we enter Stalin's final years. By this point, his cult of personality had been well and truly perfected. It's portraying him as this father of the nation type figure who had led the country to victory and had quashed all the internal foes. And here we also see the beginnings of the new Cold War, as the West and the Soviets, after the defeat of Nazi Germany, they quickly fell out with each other, eventually coming to a head with such incidents as the Berlin blockade, where the Soviets, who were a bit annoyed about the fact that the West had control of the western half of the German capital of Berlin, decided to blockade Allied transports into the city in the hopes of starving them out, while the Allies airlifted supplies into Berlin and sort of called Stalin's bluff there. Which that combined with other things such as the Truman Doctrine, in which the US has decided to proclaimed its intention and to contain communism and prevent its spread everywhere, it really well and truly started the Cold War. And the Berlin airlift is a topic which I've already done a video on, which you can check out on my channel. And here we also see other things such as Stalin's relationship with Josip Broz Tito, the leader of Yugoslavia. The Yugoslavs had effectively liberated themselves from the Axis, this albeit now under a new communist regime. And whilst initially relations between them and the Soviet Union were cordial, after a number of disagreements, Stalin got a bit fed up with Tito, tried to have him assassinated, and after a few tries, Tito rather angrily wrote a letter to Stalin and telling him to stop with the assassination attempts or Tito would have to come over there himself, and he wouldn't have to try more than once. So he was able to actually scare Stalin into backing off, something which was rather rare. And right towards the end, Stalin began to believe that a number of the Soviet Union's top doctors were actually planning on poisoning him, so he had them arrested, sent off to the gulags or executed. And then right after that, he suffered a stroke and a cerebral hemorrhage. So, sort of backfired there. And with that came the death of Stalin. And there was a power struggle that ensued. Many expected him to be succeeded by the deputy premier of the Soviet Union, Georgy Malenkov, or by the head of the NKVD, now the KGB, Lavrentiy Beria. However, it would be neither of them, as the leadership struggle would actually end up being won out by Nikita Khrushchev, who would lead the Soviet Union from about the mid-50s until his own ousting from power in 1964. And Khrushchev, he was something of a reformer. He engaged in a number of policies called de-Stalinization. We sought to somewhat dial back Stalin's cult of personality and actually even fully denounce Stalin in what was since become known as the secret speech. And whilst he would eventually get ousted from power and replaced by Leonid Brezhnev, who was a bit more Stalinist leaning, Khrushchev still clearly had some degree of impact on Soviet culture, as rather than being executed when he was ousted, he was simply forced into retirement. So he was at least partially successful in that goal. So, what can we say about Joseph Stalin? Brutal dictator, genocidal maniac, a man who led his country to victory against the Nazis in World War II, and undoubtedly one of the single most important figures in 20th century history. Thank you very much for watching. If you have enjoyed that video, please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. If you'd like to see more, please leave a comment down below if you have any further questions or any topics that you'd like me to cover, and I'll be sure to answer as many of them as I can. And I'll see you all in the next video. Goodbye.